So we all know music can shift our mood. We all know that music has a capacity to shift our entire way of being. We can listen to our favorite song and all of a sudden feel good where we might have felt aggravated. Like we all kind of know that, but then to like really follow that all the way is a different ball game, because what that points to is how sound really does have the capacity to shift our physiology.
So taking us a little more forward here, I want to kind of close out this MTV tenure, because I know it was something hard for you to do. I can tell it was, because it was like this dream job, which most people never even ever get to in their lives. But there was, and correct me if I'm wrong or putting words in your mouth, but there was some lack of like violating, or there was a violation of your own kind of integrity, which kind of led to the departure, right? Or maybe there's a better way to say that, but fill us in a little bit on what led to that kind of, hey man, I'm peacing out from my dream job. Like, this is it.
Yeah. I mean, it was a few things. I think that I was noticing that the culture in the building was changing. And there was a moment where I bumped into a young rapper named Kanye West out in front of Irving Plaza as he was about to jump on stage with Talib Kweli, who was performing at Irving Plaza that night. And they were on this Get By remix together at the time. And so Kanye got a moment to shine on stage. Before he was known as a rapper, he was a producer who made that beat for Get By. And, you know, there was a moment where I got to see him in that emerging moment in time where people were still not knowing whether to take him seriously. And so I remember turning to my producers at MTV the next day and trying to convince them to have Kanye come on and get a segment on the show that I was hosting at the time. And that became an interesting moment for me of seeing where the culture was changing. There wasn't the same sort of taste-making boldness that seemed to be at the core of what made MTV cool in the first place. There was a little bit more to lose. It felt like it was a little bit more, you know, I'm not sure if we want to give this guy real estate on the channel because he's not proven, and what would happen if the audience doesn't really take to him or whatever, right? That whole line of thinking versus the sort of innovator, that sort of MTV spirit that we fell in love with to begin with, that made it cool. So that was one piece of it, but definitely the part you're talking about is when Kanye came on a few years later. And I remember it was basically a moment that revealed to me where I definitely could have listened to my intuition a little bit more. Yeah. So I don't want to put it on this producer completely, but this producer did have a pre-interview with Kanye where he expressed the desire to not talk about an incident that had happened at a club the night before. It was an MTV award after party, and there was a shooting. Suge Knight was involved. Kanye told the producer in the pre-interview he didn't want to talk about it on live TV, understandably. Didn't want to incriminate himself. And she kind of conveyed it to me in a way that was not altogether clear how adamant he was about not talking about it. She said basically he'd rather not talk about it.
Oh, okay.
And so in that moment I made up, well, okay, to satisfy the sort of desire in the zeitgeist to know what happened, or maybe just for us to be a relevant show, you know, a daily show, news type show that, you know, needed to seem like we were up on things. So how about I just reference it and then we can move about the conversation in a different way. I asked him a question that was actually quite open-ended and didn't pin him to talking about the night, but Kanye, as we know now, is not the greatest listener. And so he sort of checked out as soon as I started referencing the night before, and he flipped out and he started yelling at the producer off camera. And it became this moment that I talked about in my TED Talk at length. If you want to click over there after this conversation to see the whole thing. But it was definitely a moment that had me really look at how that happened. How did it happen that someone who I once helped get on the network could have that sort of a feeling on the network now years later, and for me to not feel like I could really trust my producers to actually convey information in a clear way that would have me set up to win on live television. It all kind of felt like it was the crack. It was the crack where I sort of, the romanticism about being there was very, very apparent to me. It was like, okay, this may not be the thing for me anymore. This may not be the kind of environment, the situation I want to put myself in. And like I said, it came down to also having interviewed everybody under the sun at that point, and having felt like creatively not so fulfilled because I sort of gotten to that point where, Stevie Wonder, when he was coming on Total Request Live, made a point of requesting me as the interviewer, right? So that gives you a bit of sense of like where I'd gotten to in that equation, and felt like, okay, is there more for me here in this context, or is it time to play a different game? And so that's basically it. That's, that was the jumping off pad. And I'm always grateful for my time at MTV, but it certainly, ultimately pointed to a passion for music that needed to find other outlets. And for ultimately what was sound. For me, like, music was always so healing growing up. Like it was the place where I was able to make meaning. Like hip hop to me was cathartic. It was therapeutic because I was able to hear and feel pain expressed through DMX and the way he was putting songs out and the way he was expressing, that was like a note that I needed to feel because I had all this angst in me as a kid that I didn't know where to put. Yeah. And so there was someone representing and manifesting that and putting that music out in a way that I could like really tap into that feeling. Yeah. And so that all really pointed to what ended up being my calling in sound, and being able to create that kind of a soundscape for people that, is very meditative and healing in a different way.
That's beautiful, man. And yeah, dude, music to me, same type of music. I grew up listening to all that as well, and very healing for me too. Like to have those outlets, to have things that I remember listening to stuff like that before I got into soccer games, and I'd put it on my mom's minivan. I'd put it in the disc player, and I'd put it in the minivan. We listened to a couple songs before I got out on the field, and it was like it helped you to release some of this and also build up some of that adrenaline for you. It was really powerful, man. I love music. Huge fan of that, and huge fan of DMX, huge fan of Bone Thugs and Harmony. Grew up with that, and a lot of fun listening to that stuff. But going into music, let's do this now. Like, so you're now in this space where you're taking music down to a very, very like base level to create the empowerment and healing through that. And let's talk a little bit about, I would love to shed some light about what this means and what you're doing also with healing, but maybe also blending a little bit about what you learned through music through all these years being part of music, listening to it, being on MTV, all those things, how that's helped you to maybe blend even what you're doing now and probably being better at it than a lot of other people.
Well, I think it's not altogether novel what I'm about to say, but it's interesting how most people don't actually tap into the awareness, right? So we all know music can shift our mood. We all know that music has a capacity to shift our entire way of being. We can listen to our favorite song and all of a sudden feel good where we might have felt aggravated. Like we all kind of know that, but then to like really follow that all the way is a different ball game, because what that points to is how sound really does have the capacity to shift our physiology. Actually, we've actually now seen microscopic studies with the gong being played with someone near a gong, and experiencing a gong like that actually creates a different constitution in the red blood cells in people's body. There's actually a rounding out of the blood cell when it's exposed to a gong sound, and it spaces out from the other cells. There's more space that occurs between the red blood cells as the gong is playing, right? So it's like that takes our sort of notion of how music is an influential thing to a whole nother ball game. When you think about the meditative state you can get into when you set up your physiology that way, right? So there's like the meditator in me that went to a 10-day silent Vipassana retreat and sat in silence and meditated hours a day. I got to a certain level of depth in my meditation and my practice and in my self, being able to connect dots and make meaning that was empowering, etc. So for me, sound meditation has been a whole different ballgame where I've been able to really set up my physiology to go as deep as possible. So imagine, meditation without that tension that happens the first part of the meditation when you're trying to get into it, you're trying to drop in, right? Like most meditators will sit there like a little bit irritated for the first, 10 minutes until they eventually get to a place where they're dropped in. But what we've discovered with sound is that it's really a fast track to getting an even deeper state of meditation and what we call theta state, which is where so much creativity can happen, so much insight, so much healing, and when I think about healing, it's not a woo-woo thing for me. It's actually the ability to really connect dots within oneself that has us empowered to live a life that a healed person would lead. Like for me, healing meant connecting the dots on how my father was abused and therefore he almost had no choice. Like that's all he knew. And so it's like short of having the meditative state to be able to go back to that level of compassion for my father, make sense of that, all of that, like it's the connective tissue of what I understand healing to be. It's not just this, magic wand that gets hit on us one day and we're healed. What I'm doing with sound is not magic. It's really just creating the conditions for us to actually do that work within ourselves, to like get to that point of compassion for our parents where we don't have, an edge on us next time we talk to our mother. That to me is like the practical application of these spaces that we create in the wellness world. And so sound is a really great tool. We can use it in everyday life. I mean, truly, you don't need to come to my next sound meditation to get some of what I'm talking about here. You can literally just lay down in Shavasana with headphones on and play a song that has a certain level of meditation quality to it, right? Like we're not talking about Taylor Swift's latest banger. We're talking about, something from, ideally it's going to be something that has more of that sort of meditative quality to it, right? And that's going to be different for everybody. I listen to certain songs by like Dafur Youssef, from the East, and what they do with the sonics and the soundscapes over there are different than sort of this Western, pop culture thing, which, again, there's nothing wrong with it. There's a time and place. I love me some pop music when it's time to turn up and dance and all of that. But if you want to go in deep and you want to get some clarity about your next step in life, or you want to, really shake off maybe this last chapter you've had, like you went through a divorce or some traumatic thing, you want to get to a place of resolution, you want a certain soundscape to really support that, right? You want to be able to like feel your nervous system reset and really allow for the peace that is available in life to like wash all over you. These are the things that we do in these sound meditations and these experiences. And so it's a beautiful thing, man, to be able to create that space for people to do that kind of work. And to me, it's the least dogmatic thing I've ever been exposed to, because it really is just working with the power of sound and ultimately creating a space for each one of the participants to be the greatest healer. It's really not me doing anything other than playing some instruments and creating an intentional environment, and psychedelics laid on top of it. It's an even deeper experience. And so it's been an honor to be able to do this work.